All right, now let's talk about some of the specific exercises themselves. Right, this first one is, obviously the most basic one, probably the easiest one for students to do. A myth or a fable. Begin with something that they know pretty well. Now, obviously, students in the second quarter of the 21st century probably don't know myths and fables as well as students from a generation or two ago, perhaps. But depend on what you're doing with the reading in class. Certainly, these exercises probably would work very well in conjunction with what you're reading for the literary aspect of the class. They might work well as individual things separate from what you're reading, but especially these early ones, since they're based on responding to what students know, responding to stories, recreating stories in their own voice. Having students, build off what they are reading in class could be a very effective way for these, especially these first three or four exercises themselves. So, just another a little tip, which is probably why we're here. So, this myth, whether it's something that they read, something they know about, something they do a research one, focus on what the main aspect of this particular exercise is about, right? As you can see, right? Retell the story, amplify or abbreviate. The main purpose of this first exercise is to have the students focus on, can they, do they know the story? Can they shorten it so it still makes sense? Can they amplify it, make it a little more dramatic, more exciting? Maybe add some characters, add a plot twist, things like that. Now, ninth graders probably should be able to do that pretty well, right? Now, the grammar school, their expectations are much smaller in the sense of what a student knows and what a student is able to do as far as abbreviating or amplifying a story. But for ninth grade, this shouldn't be too much of a challenge, right? Something that's pretty well known. Don't have them, don't pick some movie that they've only they have seen, or some episode of a TV show or something like that. Some fairly universal story that still has some traction even in 2020 and beyond. You know, that they will know about, and that person reading this or grading this certainly knows enough about as well. Okay, have them. They can, as the point 4 says, change the focus of the story, the arrangement, outcome, things like that. Good practice if they want to be a Hollywood movie maker, change the outcome of a well-known story, something like that. Can be used for memorization, recitation. Certainly, that is there for this and every other particular exercise. You can do that or not, depending on if you want to focus on it as a writing activity. Okay, so this next slide here has some examples of some ideas of some classic Aesop fables. You can certainly do those. Myths that you're reading about in world literature, that's 10th grade, but other things that they know, things like that. Just so you know that, especially if the same teacher is doing number 1 here, the myth, and number 2, the folk tale, or the narrative tale, make sure that you draw on different areas of literary stories to do that. Don't do the same story for this first one and then do it slightly different for the second story. Draw on a different kind of genre here. Have all the students focus on a myth here for this first one, or a fable, something like that, beast fable. I know the other slide said fairy tales. Maybe save those for the second one. Some very simple story here that can focus on just the skill of reciting the content, making it a little shorter, making it a little longer. That's the main idea here of the folktale. Okay. The second one is the tale, the narrative. Whereas the first one has the myth has a moral center to it, which they can use to practice their amplification. The tale is maybe just more a common, more well-known story. So your parameters are a little bit broader. This might be a good one for a fairy tale, folk tale, things like that. And so have them retell a story in their own words. That could certainly be summarizing a novel they read for class, or maybe probably a short story might be more effective, or just a well-known story that you and they know. Again, especially for ninth grade, having the students focus on well-known things, not just a particular short story that they know, or some movie or show that only they know about that you don't know about. That's it could have a time and a place, but for this particular exercise, you want something that everybody knows and can really draw on their communal experience of knowing this story. Okay. Focus as well on contraction of the story and expansion of the story, not just a paraphrase certainly, but The difference is really, how can they really expand on it in a way that really focuses on the key ideas of the story, right? Whereas the myth is just make the story a little bit longer, make a little bit of story. The second one focuses on the similar skills, but mainly on what is the moral, the kernel, the ideas, the morals of this story, and how can I expand on that story a little bit to really continue to amplify what the moral center of the story is really about. Okay, so fiction works pretty well for it. Maybe nonfiction account, this might be a good one for helping students to practice sort of like a historical fiction type activity. A well-known event, maybe a good sort of combination of history and English class together. Retell sort of like, Michael Shara, Jeff Shara, stories of battles or wars or something from the viewpoint of a character who may have lived it or maybe didn't, like sort of the Johnny Tremaine type thing that your students could do. If this character was in this particular historical thing, what might he or she see? And they can focus on the facts of the event, but tell it from a sort of made up individual that can sort of interact with a real history and from a literary perspective as well. So don't just paraphrase, which is kind of what the myth was about. Focus on the ability to focus on not just the content, but what are the ideas that generate that content here. Okay, the essential elements of a plot, certainly, as well as really even beyond bullet point 4. It's really about the ideas that make up why does the story exist, not just what happens, but what is the story trying to tell us. Okay, and so give students familiarity with myths and folktales. Certainly, the first one, focus on something different, like in this one, historical story. Fairy tales certainly work well also. Okay, here's again some examples that you can do. Some well-known, folk tales, fairy tales, things like that. Here's a link to some African folk tales and others. But have the students be pretty familiar. Don't just, if they're going to pick like an African folk tale or something like that they may not be familiar with, this task really works well with a story that the students know pretty well already. So I would not say, all right, read this story for the first time and now do this task with it. It still should be something that they know well enough that they can really think about. All right, not only am I expanding on the story, maybe adding a character, or here I know this historical event, but I'm going to really continue to drive home what is the key themes, the key ideas, the moral center of the story, and focus on elaborating on that. Okay, that's what I think the main difference between the myth and the tale is. It's not just which genre of literature do you draw on, though there's certainly that element too, but one's just basic storytelling skills versus the ideas that make up that story. Why is this story the way it is? What is this hero? What idea does this hero represent? And why does this character win versus this character lose? Things like that, right? That's something that you can really emphasize with the tale more so than just the myth of exercise 1. Okay, then so because of that, focusing on the style goals certainly, and the basic news making, who, what, when, where, how, and why, the basics. But even beyond that, again, the how and the why certainly I think are really crucial to the narrative, to this thing. How was it done? Not just what happened. That's important. Who was there? What happened? But why? How was it done? Why was it done this way? These things. What the reason why this hero survived, or reason that this character survived? Was the character successful in what he or she was trying to do, or something like that? The why is certainly the crucial aspect, I think, of this second one. Okay, so that is hopefully some helpful thoughts on the differences between the myth and the narrative. Okay, the third one is pretty radically different. Those first two are certainly connected. A lot of these you'll notice come in pairs. The first two responding to fiction different ways. The third and the fourth, Kreia and the proverb, are just not so much about stories or fiction, but about wise sayings, how to interact with quotations and sayings from history, from popular culture, from things like that. this one, the Crea, is, its name is translates roughly into being useful, and it certainly is, especially, in today, for a lot of college applications, especially SAT essays still use this sort of thing. Here's the saying: respond to this and tell us what you think about this thing. Do you agree with that? That's still, thousands of years later, still the heart of education and moving students from one level of education to the next. So this one especially should be one that this activity should be used maybe multiple times in multiple years, ninth grade, and I used to do it in 11th grade as well, because a lot of American literature with Ben Franklin and his witty sayings, things like that. This works really well in 11th grade also. So the basic idea: you take a quotation that you know from a source that you can also talk about, and that's the main difference between the Crea and the proverb here. Number four is the third one is who said it, and so you draw upon the person as well. It certainly gives them that classical things about not just the logic of it, but the character, the ethos of who said it, the source material. Right. So 8 steps. You don't necessarily do all of them every single time, but definitely I would say the first few times students are doing this, uh, do all 8 steps because it becomes very helpful. Okay, and so here's some more benefits that you can look at your leisure. This video is kind of running long already, so we'll move on. So here are the 8 steps. You begin with a brief praise of the speaker. There's a sample here, and you don't need me to really harp too much on the 8 steps, but definitely encourage students to do them. Begin with the praise. Here's this wise saying from Ben Franklin or something. He certainly knew what he was talking about because Ben Franklin came from this situation, and this is why he is qualified to speak on this issue, right? Have the students paraphrase so they know what is really at the heart. Haste makes waste. What does that really mean? When I hear haste makes waste, here's what I think of, right? Direct proof, the focus on the logic, the intrinsic logic of it. Suppose the opposite for the contrast, then refute why the opposite is not true. These are really the heart of a lot of what you do for the senior thesis. So this task especially is very useful, very important. Have the students try to do this well. And here are several proofs on how you can elaborate on the Crea, right? Analogies, examples, specific examples. We do that all the time in English class, history class, all papers anyway. That should be fairly easy. Cite an authority. So, give them a chance to practice doing a little bit of research, maybe a famous, Bartlett's quotation, something like that, some resource that, here's the topic, find a famous quotation, they can work it in. Not only Ben Franklin said it, but also when this person said it, in 19th century, something like that. Okay, and then exhortation, a good chance to end with a new kind of conclusion, not just here's my introduction, here's my recap conclusion. Now that they know what they believe what this saying means and they have it, in their hearts a little bit stronger, I can tell you, maybe even have the students use first person and second person pronouns here. Have them talk directly to the audience. Now you know why haste makes waste. Here's what we should do with this information. Okay, so this third one especially is a very practical, very helpful one. It gives them a good framework for how to interact with quotations, and maybe not just on the SATs or college applications, but a great way for them to interact with sayings intellectually for themselves. Why are people saying this thing to me? Why is this slogan? Why is this advertising, catchphrase? What is it really trying to say? Things like that. So this third one especially is really good. And here's an example. Running out of time here for this one, but the fourth, the proverb, is very similar, except it takes out the really the main distinction, as I said, is that you don't know where it came from. So you focus primarily not on, well, because Ben Franklin said it, now we can know why it's true. But here's this common saying, bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. What does that mean intrinsically? And so you focus on the moral aspect, the intrinsic logic of these things and why they're still useful for us today, even though we don't know where they came from, who said it. These wise sayings are still useful for us today. So again, a practical proverb sort of thing there. I know I went through that one kind of quickly, but this one I think makes sense, especially when you focus on the third one. Okay, so here's the basic. You can look at this basic list, and there you go. All right, we'll see you soon.